June 6, 1944. In the early hours before dawn, the English Channel was filled with ships. Thousands of vessels stretched across the water as far as the eye could see. Destroyers, landing craft, transport ships, and battleships moved slowly toward the coast of occupied France. Inside them were more than 150,000 Allied soldiers preparing for what would become the largest amphibious invasion in human history. For years, Nazi Germany had controlled most of Europe. France had fallen in 1940. The Soviet Union had been locked in a brutal war with Germany on the Eastern Front since 1941. Millions had already died. The invasion of Normandy was supposed to change everything. If the Allies could secure a foothold in France, they would open a second front in Europe. German forces would be forced to fight on two sides at once, and eventually, the Third Reich would collapse under the pressure. In our timeline, that is exactly what happened. But history is often shaped by small moments. A delayed order, a division arriving too soon, a commander making a different decision. And if just a few of those moments had changed on June 6th, the invasion of Normandy might have failed completely. The beaches of France could have become a disaster for the Allies, and World War II might have taken a very different path. Tonight, we explore the alternate history of what might have happened if D-Day had failed. Welcome to Echoes of History, a channel dedicated to exploring the moments where history could have taken a different path. From the battles that shaped civilizations to the political decisions that changed the fate of nations, we examine alternate timelines and turning points that could have rewritten the world we know today. Because sometimes the smallest moment can echo across centuries. This is Echoes of History. By the summer of 1944, the Second World War had already consumed much of the globe. Entire continents had been transformed into battlefields, and the conflict had entered a stage where the outcome depended less on individual battles and more on the massive industrial power of the nations involved. Nazi Germany still controlled an enormous empire across Europe. From the Atlantic coast of France to deep inside the Soviet Union, German forces occupied vast territories and governed millions of people through military authority and collaborationist regimes. Cities like Paris, Warsaw, and Prague remained under the shadow of the Third Reich. But beneath the appearance of German dominance, the situation was beginning to change. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had survived the brutal early years of the war and was beginning to push westward. Battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Soviet forces were slowly reclaiming lost territory, but the fighting remained unimaginably costly. Entire divisions vanished in the chaos of armoured warfare across the plains of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, in the West, the United States had transformed itself into what many historians would later call the arsenal of democracy. American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, trucks, artillery, and ships at a scale no nation had ever seen before. Liberty ships rolled out of shipyards faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft production soared into the tens of thousands each year. Entire armoured divisions were being equipped and trained for return to Europe. Britain, though exhausted by years of bombing and war, remained a critical staging ground for the coming invasion. Airfields across southern England were crowded with Allied aircraft preparing to support the assault on continental Europe. For Allied leaders, the strategic challenge was clear. Germany had to be defeated in Europe, but doing so required opening a second front. Since 1941, the Soviet Union had been carrying the vast majority of the ground fighting against Germany. Joseph Stalin repeatedly demanded that Britain and the United States launch a major invasion of Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. For years, the Western Allies hesitated. Large amphibious invasions were extraordinarily risky. The failed Allied raid at Dieppe in 1942 had demonstrated just how deadly fortified coastlines could be. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or captured in only a few hours of fighting, But by 1944, the situation had changed. American industry was now fully mobilized. Allied air forces dominated Western Europe's skies. German naval power had been severely weakened. And perhaps most importantly, millions of Allied troops were now stationed in Britain, waiting for the opportunity to strike. The invasion plan they developed would become one of the most ambitious military operations in history. It was called Operation Overlord. The goal was simple, but staggering in scale. Land a massive Allied army in France, establish a secure beachhead, and begin the liberation of Western Europe. The operation required extraordinary coordination. More than 150,000 soldiers would land on the first day alone. Thousands of ships would cross the English Channel, carrying troops, vehicles, artillery, and supplies. Airborne divisions would drop behind enemy lines during the night, before the invasion to seize key bridges and disrupt German defences. Naval bombardment from battleships and cruisers would hammer coastal fortifications. Fighter aircraft would protect the skies above the invasion fleet. And once the beachheads were secure, millions of additional troops would pour into France to push toward Germany itself. If the operation succeeded, the Third Reich would be forced to fight a massive war on two fronts. But if the invasion failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers could be trapped and destroyed along the beaches. The Allies might not be able to attempt another invasion for years, and Germany would gain precious time to stabilise its position in Europe. In our timeline, Operation Overlord succeeded, but history is rarely inevitable. In this alternate timeline, the events surrounding D-Day unfold very differently, and a few critical decisions made before the invasion begin to change the course of the war. The invasion of Western Europe required a level of planning that few military operations in history had ever demanded. For nearly 2 years, Allied leaders debated how and when such an invasion should occur. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, American President Franklin Roosevelt, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin all agreed that defeating Germany required returning Allied armies to mainland Europe. But deciding exactly how to do that proved far more difficult. The English Channel presented both an opportunity and a barrier. At its narrowest point, the distance between Britain and France was just over 20 miles. That made it the most direct route for Allied forces attempting to invade German-occupied Europe. But it also meant German defences were heavily concentrated there. The Pas-de-Calais region of northern France had become one of the most fortified areas along the entire Atlantic Wall. German artillery batteries overlooked the water. Concrete bunkers housed machine gun positions. Anti-tank obstacles and mines filled the beaches. Any invasion there would face massive resistance. Because of this, Allied planners began looking at other possible landing sites. One region quickly drew their attention: Normandy. The coastline of Normandy offered several advantages. Its beaches were wide enough to support large amphibious landings. The terrain behind the beaches provided access to important road networks leading inland. And perhaps most importantly, German defences there were not as heavily concentrated as those guarding the Pas-de-Calais. But Normandy also came with serious risks. The region was farther from Britain, meaning the invasion fleet would have to travel longer distances across open water. The beaches were surrounded by cliffs, hedgerows, and narrow roads that could slow the advance of Allied forces once they landed. If German forces could be convinced that the invasion would happen somewhere else, the Allies might be able to establish a foothold before the German army could respond. To achieve this, the Allies launched one of the most elaborate deception campaigns in military history. It was known as Operation Fortitude. Across southern England, entire fake armies were created. Inflatable tanks were placed in open fields where German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph them. Wooden aircraft and fake landing craft were constructed along the coastline. Radio operators transmitted fake messages suggesting massive troop movements toward the Pas de Calais. Perhaps the most convincing part of the deception involved General George S. Patton. Patton was one of the most famous American commanders of the war. German intelligence believed that if the Allies launched their main invasion, Patton would certainly be in charge of it. So the Allies assigned him to command a completely fictional army group. The 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, appeared to be assembling in southeast England. German intelligence monitored radio transmissions suggesting that Patton's forces were preparing for a massive landing at Calais. From the German perspective, everything pointed toward Calais being the main target. Meanwhile, the real invasion force quietly gathered in ports along the southern coast of England. Thousands of ships were assembled. Landing craft were loaded with tanks, artillery, and trucks. Soldiers trained for months, practicing amphibious assaults along British beaches. Every detail of the invasion was planned with extraordinary precision. 5 landing zones were chosen along the Normandy coastline. From west to east, they were given the code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. American forces would land at Utah and Omaha. British forces would land at Gold and Sword. Canadian forces would land at Juno. Each beach would be supported by naval bombardment and airstrikes designed to weaken German defences before the soldiers arrived. At the same time, airborne divisions would parachute behind enemy lines to capture bridges and disrupt German reinforcements. If everything went according to plan, Allied forces would link together along the beaches within hours. Within days, they would begin pushing inland toward the city of Caen and eventually toward Paris. But despite the enormous scale of the planning effort, Allied commanders understood something important. No plan survives contact with the enemy, and the success of Operation Overlord depended on one crucial factor above all others: speed. The invasion had to establish a strong foothold before German reinforcements could arrive. If German armoured divisions were able to counterattack the beachheads quickly enough, the invasion could collapse before it ever truly began. In our timeline, delays within the German command structure slowed the response, but in this alternate history, those delays disappear, and that small change would prove to be enough to alter the outcome of the entire invasion. Long before Allied troops began gathering in Britain, Germany had already begun preparing for the invasion they knew would eventually come. The defence system they constructed along the western coast of Europe became known as the Atlantic Wall. Stretching from the northern tip of Norway down through Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and all the way along the French coastline to the border of Spain, the Atlantic Wall was intended to form an enormous barrier between Nazi-occupied Europe and the Allied forces gathering across the Channel. In theory, it was one of the largest defensive systems ever constructed. Concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, machine gun nests, observation posts, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles were placed along hundreds of miles of coastline. German engineers built thick fortifications designed to withstand heavy naval bombardment. Some bunkers had walls several feet thick, capable of resisting even large-caliber artillery shells. Along the beaches themselves, engineers installed what soldiers would later describe as deadly mazes of obstacles. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and metal frames were driven into the sand at angles designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. Many of these obstacles were rigged with explosives that would detonate if ships struck them during high tide. Behind the beaches, fields were seeded with thousands of landmines. Barbed wire stretched across dunes and hillsides. Artillery batteries were carefully positioned so they could fire across likely landing zones. From above, the coastline began to resemble a fortress, but despite its intimidating name, the Atlantic Wall had serious weaknesses. The greatest challenge facing the German military was not building defences, it was the enormous length of coastline they were trying to defend. Western Europe had hundreds of miles of beaches, cliffs, harbours, and possible landing zones. No army, no matter how well organised, could defend every mile equally. German commanders were forced to make strategic decisions about where the invasion was most likely to occur. Most believed the Allies would strike at Pas de Calais. The logic was simple. Calais was the closest point between Britain and France, making it the shortest crossing for invasion forces. It also contained several major ports that would allow the Allies to unload troops and equipment much more easily than along open beaches. Because of this assumption, the German High Command concentrated many of their strongest defences and units around that region. Normandy, by comparison, was less heavily fortified. It still had bunkers, artillery, and defensive positions, but the scale of construction there was smaller than in areas closer to Calais. Many German officers believed Normandy would only be a secondary target, or possibly even a diversion. This assumption would prove critical. The man most concerned about the weakness of these defences was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had earned fame earlier in the war as the commander of German forces in North Africa. His aggressive tactics and ability to manoeuvre armoured units had earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. By 1944, Rommel had been assigned to help oversee the defence of Western Europe. After inspecting the coastline, he became deeply worried. Rommel believed the Allied invasion would come with overwhelming force. The Allies had air superiority, massive naval fleets, and the industrial resources of the United States behind them. Once Allied troops managed to land and establish a foothold, they would begin bringing tanks, artillery, and supplies ashore in huge quantities. If that happened, pushing them back into the sea would become almost impossible. Rommel's conclusion was simple. The invasion had to be stopped at the beaches themselves. He argued that German armoured divisions should be positioned close to the coastline, ready to counterattack immediately when the landings began. If tanks and infantry could strike the beachheads within the first few hours, the invasion might be crushed before Allied forces could organise themselves. But not everyone in the German command structure agreed. Other generals believed armoured divisions should remain inland, where they could be used as a strategic reserve once the main invasion point was identified. Adolf Hitler himself became involved in the debate. Ultimately, many of Germany's powerful panzer divisions were held back under Hitler's personal control. They would only be released once it became clear exactly where the invasion was happening. In our timeline, this delay proved disastrous for Germany. The Allied landings secured a foothold before German armoured units could fully respond. But in this alternate timeline, events unfold differently. Rommel's concerns about the coastline are taken more seriously. German commanders begin adjusting their defensive posture. Several armoured formations are moved closer to Normandy. Communication between coastal units is tightened. Observation posts are instructed to report any unusual activity immediately. The Atlantic Wall, though still imperfect, becomes a far more dangerous obstacle than Allied planners expect. And when the invasion finally begins, those small adjustments will make a critical difference. By early 1944, Germany's military leadership understood that the war in Western Europe was approaching a decisive moment. The Allies had assembled enormous forces in Britain. German intelligence could see the signs clearly. Ports crowded with ships, airfields filled with aircraft, and massive troop movements across southern England. An invasion was coming. The only question was where and when. Among the German commanders responsible for defending the coastline, no one took this threat more seriously than Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had built a reputation earlier in the war as one of Germany's most capable battlefield commanders. During the North African campaign, he had led daring armoured manoeuvres against British forces, earning respect even from his enemies. His ability to react quickly and exploit weaknesses had made him one of Germany's most famous generals. But by 1944, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Germany was no longer advancing across Europe. Instead, it was preparing to defend the territory it had already conquered. When Rommel began inspecting the Atlantic Wall defences in France, he quickly realised something troubling. The coastal defences were far weaker than German propaganda suggested. While many areas had bunkers and artillery, large sections of coastline were still vulnerable. In some places, construction crews were still pouring concrete for defensive positions. In others, the defences consisted of little more than scattered obstacles and small garrisons. Rommel understood that the Allies possessed overwhelming advantages. The United States had become the most powerful industrial nation in the world. American factories were producing ships, aircraft and vehicles at astonishing speed. British forces had years of experience fighting Germany, and Allied air power now dominated the skies above Western Europe. If the Allies succeeded in landing a large army in France, Germany might not be able to stop them. Rommel believed the invasion had to be crushed immediately. His strategy focused on one simple principle: stop the Allies at the water's edge. He argued that German armoured divisions should be positioned close to the coastline. If Allied troops began landing on the beaches, tanks and infantry could counterattack within the first few hours, before the invasion force had time to organise. Rommel believed this early response was critical. Once the Allies brought heavy equipment ashore, artillery, tanks, supply trucks, the balance of power would begin shifting rapidly in their favour. German forces might never be able to push them back, but not everyone in the German High Command agreed with Rommel's approach. Some generals believed that placing armoured divisions near the coast would make them vulnerable to Allied air attacks. Instead, they preferred to keep the tanks further inland as a mobile reserve. Their strategy was to wait until the main invasion point was identified, then launch a massive counterattack using concentrated, armoured forces. This disagreement created a dangerous division in Germany's defensive planning. Some armoured units were positioned near the coastline, others were held far inland under direct control of the German High Command, and ultimately under Adolf Hitler himself. In practice, this meant that many of Germany's most powerful tank divisions could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. In a fast-moving battle, that delay could prove disastrous. Rommel continued warning that the invasion could come at any moment. He pushed for more mines to be laid along the beaches. Engineers were ordered to plant thousands of wooden stakes, known as Rommel's asparagus, in fields and open areas behind the coast to prevent Allied gliders from landing. Additional obstacles were placed along the shoreline to damage landing craft during high tide. Rommel's inspections often took him directly to the beaches themselves. Standing on the windswept coast of Normandy, he studied the terrain carefully. Wide beaches stretched toward the sea. Low cliffs and dunes overlooked potential landing zones. Small villages and narrow roads wound their way inland. Rommel could easily imagine what would happen if thousands of Allied soldiers suddenly appeared on those beaches. He also knew that Germany's defences were not perfect. Despite months of preparation, many areas remained vulnerable. German forces simply did not have enough troops or resources to fortify every mile of coastline. And even as Rommel pushed for stronger defences in France, the war continued raging on other fronts. In the east, German armies were still locked in brutal combat with the Soviet Union. In the skies above Germany, Allied bombers were striking factories, railways, and cities with increasing intensity. Every resource Germany devoted to defending France was a resource that could not be used elsewhere. By late spring of 1944, the tension was rising on both sides of the English Channel. Allied commanders were preparing to launch the largest invasion in history. German forces were bracing themselves for the attack they knew was coming. But even as Rommel worked to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, he could not know exactly when the invasion would begin, or that in this alternate timeline, the small adjustments he had pushed for would change everything. Because when the Allied Armada finally crossed the Channel, Germany would be ready to respond faster than anyone expected. By early June of 1944, Southern England had become the staging ground for the largest invasion force ever assembled. Across ports, airfields, and temporary military camps, Allied troops prepared for the operation that would determine the future of Western Europe. American, British, and Canadian soldiers gathered alongside enormous quantities of equipment: tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition, and supplies meant to support the first wave of the invasion. More than 150,000 soldiers were scheduled to land on the beaches of Normandy on the first day alone. Behind them stood millions more, who would follow once the beachheads were secured. But before the invasion could begin, the Allies faced a challenge that no commander could control: the weather. The English Channel was notoriously unpredictable. Strong winds and rough seas could easily disrupt an amphibious invasion, scattering landing craft and delaying reinforcements. Poor visibility could also interfere with airborne operations, preventing paratroopers from landing where they were needed most. Originally, the invasion had been scheduled for early June. As the date approached, however, the weather began to deteriorate. Storm systems formed over the channel, bringing heavy winds and dangerous waves that threatened to delay the entire operation. Allied commanders gathered to make a decision. Among them was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower understood that the decision before him carried enormous consequences. If the invasion was delayed too long, the deception operations meant to mislead German intelligence could begin to fail. German commanders might strengthen their defences in Normandy or move additional forces toward the region. But launching the invasion during poor weather could also lead to disaster. After reviewing the forecasts and consulting with his staff, Eisenhower made one of the most important decisions of the war. The invasion would proceed. During the night of June 5th, thousands of ships began moving across the English Channel toward France. The invasion fleet stretched across miles of ocean. Landing ships, troop transports, destroyers, minesweepers, and massive battleships slowly moved through the darkness. The engines of thousands of vessels churned the water as the armada advanced toward the Normandy coastline. For the soldiers aboard those ships, the journey was tense and quiet. Many had spent months preparing for this moment. They had practiced amphibious landings along the British coast, studied maps of the French countryside, and listened to their commanders explain the objectives of the invasion. Now, as the ships carried them toward enemy territory, the reality of the mission became clear. Inside cramped landing craft, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping rifles and equipment, while waves slammed against the metal hulls. Some tried to sleep. Others wrote final letters home. Many simply stared into the darkness, waiting for the moment when the ramps would drop and the battle would begin. Above them, the skies were already filling with aircraft. Shortly after midnight, thousands of Allied paratroopers began boarding transport planes across southern England. Their mission was critical. Airborne divisions would land behind German defences in Normandy, capturing bridges, securing roads, and disrupting communications. By doing so, they hoped to slow German reinforcements, while the main invasion force secured the beaches. Soon, hundreds of aircraft were heading toward the French coast. Inside the planes, paratroopers checked their gear one last time. Each soldier carried heavy loads, rifles, ammunition, grenades, radios, and supplies needed for the fighting that would begin the moment they landed. Many knew the drop would be dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire, navigation errors, and the confusion of nighttime combat could scatter units across the countryside. But their orders were clear: hold key positions long enough for the invasion to succeed. Meanwhile, on the water below, the invasion fleet continued its slow advance toward Normandy. Minesweepers moved ahead of the main force, clearing safe routes through the channel. Naval vessels prepared their guns for the bombardment that would soon begin. As dawn slowly approached, the coastline of France began to appear on the horizon. German observation posts along the Atlantic Wall started noticing unusual activity offshore. At first, the shapes looked like scattered ships in the distance, but as the light grew stronger, the scale of the approaching fleet became unmistakable. The Allied invasion had begun. Within hours, the beaches of Normandy would become one of the most important battlefields of the war. But in this alternate timeline, the events that followed would unfold very differently, because the German defenders waiting along the coast were more prepared and ready to respond far faster than the Allied commanders expected. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, long before the first landing craft approached the beaches of Normandy, the invasion had already begun in the skies above France. Hundreds of Allied transport aircraft crossed the English Channel, carrying thousands of paratroopers toward their drop zones behind German defences. Their mission was critical to the success of the entire invasion. While the main invasion force landed on the beaches, airborne troops would descend behind enemy lines to capture key bridges, block important roads, and disrupt German communications. If they succeeded, German reinforcements would be delayed long enough for the beach landings to establish a secure foothold. The operation depended heavily on timing and coordination. Paratroopers would drop into darkness during the early morning hours. Glider forces would land shortly afterward, carrying heavier equipment and additional soldiers. If everything worked as planned, these airborne units would control the surrounding countryside before the beach landings even began. But even under the best conditions, airborne operations were risky. Navigation at night was extremely difficult. Aircraft could easily drift off course. Anti-aircraft fire from German defences could scatter entire formations of planes. As the transport aircraft approached the French coast, the sky suddenly erupted with German anti-aircraft fire. Searchlights swept across the darkness, while flak batteries opened fire on the incoming planes. Explosions burst around the aircraft formations, forcing many pilots to take evasive action. Some planes climbed higher to avoid the flak. Others turned sharply or accelerated to escape the danger. In the confusion, formations began to scatter. When the first paratroopers jumped from their aircraft, many quickly realised something was wrong. Instead of landing near their intended drop zones, some units found themselves miles away from their objectives. Groups of soldiers were scattered across fields, forests, and small villages throughout the Norman countryside. Some landed in flooded areas deliberately created by German engineers to slow an invasion. Others landed directly among German patrols. Small groups of paratroopers quickly gathered whatever men they could find and began moving toward their assigned objectives. Despite the chaos, many of them continued their missions. In several locations, Allied airborne forces managed to capture bridges and crossroads that would later prove important to the invasion. But the scattered drops created serious problems as well. Entire units were separated from their commanders. Some troops had lost their radios, others had landed without heavy weapons or supplies. Instead of organised battalions moving toward their targets, the countryside now contained dozens of small groups of paratroopers trying to find their way through unfamiliar territory in the dark. Meanwhile, German forces in the area were beginning to react. The sound of aircraft engines and explosions had alerted many German units that something unusual was happening. Reports of parachutes appearing across the countryside began reaching German headquarters. At first, German commanders believed the airborne landings might simply be part of a diversion. Throughout the war, the Allies had often used smaller airborne raids to distract German forces from larger operations elsewhere. But as more reports arrived, it became clear that something far larger was underway. German patrols began searching fields and villages for Allied paratroopers. Small firefights erupted throughout the region as scattered airborne troops encountered German soldiers. In some cases, Allied paratroopers managed to ambush German patrols and capture key road intersections. In others, German units quickly surrounded and eliminated isolated groups of airborne troops. The result was a chaotic battlefield spread across dozens of miles of countryside. Fighting broke out in farmyards, forests, and small villages throughout Normandy. Some paratroopers succeeded in reaching their objectives. Others were forced to improvise, forming small fighting groups with whatever soldiers they could find nearby. Despite the confusion, the airborne assault still achieved some of its goals. Bridges were captured, roads were blocked. German commanders struggled to determine exactly how large the airborne operation was. But the scattered nature of the landings also created opportunities for the German defenders. Because the airborne troops were so widely dispersed, German units were able to respond more quickly than Allied planners had expected. Instead of facing organised airborne divisions holding key positions, German forces encountered small, isolated groups scattered across the countryside. And as German commanders began piecing together reports from the night's fighting, a larger picture began to emerge. The airborne drops were not a diversion, they were the opening phase of a much larger invasion, and somewhere along the coastline of Normandy, the main assault was about to begin. History is full of moments where everything could have changed. If you enjoyed exploring this alternate timeline, let me know what you think in the comments below. What other turning points in history should we explore next? If you enjoy alternate history and stories about the decisions that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Echoes of History so you don't miss future episodes. And if you're curious about how history might have unfolded differently in another moment, be sure to check out the next video on the channel, because sometimes the smallest moment can echo through history forever.